Hello, I'm Karol Boudreaux, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and one of the co-authors of the IEA's publication entitled Paths to Property, which is here. Over the last 3 years, I've also been serving as lead researcher for a project that's a partnership between the IEA, the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and the Free Market Foundation of Southern Africa. The project is called Enterprise Africa, and the focus of this project is trying to identify enterprise-based solutions to poverty in Africa. The reason we started the project was to have a voice in the larger development debate. The debate has taken shape over the past 40 to 50 years in the following manner. There have been a series of voices, academic voices, development voices, suggesting that the way to solve the problems of poverty in the developing world are through infusions of cash, through an effort to close the investment gap. There have been other theorists who've suggested that what's really needed is a transfer of technological capability or efforts to develop infrastructure in the developing world. And then finally, there's another group of theorists, academicians, and policymakers who really focus on the institutional environment in the developing world and suggest that one of the key issues that people in the developing world, leaders, policymakers, as well as individuals in international institutions who are funding efforts in the developing world, what they need to focus on is creating more vigorous, more vibrant institutions in the developing world. Institutions such as a rule of law, such as secure rights to property, such as contracting rules and norms that will allow for more expansive trading relationships, both among people in the developing world and then between the developing world and the developed world. Our work over the last 3 years has been looking at the kinds of institutional barriers that people in the developing world tend to face when they attempt to enter into businesses, when they attempt to grow businesses. We've looked at a series of case studies over the past 3 years, trying to identify either government policies that create space for entrepreneurship or looking at examples of individual efforts to grow and start businesses. As a result of this work, we've identified a common thread that creates problems for entrepreneurs in most countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and that is a lack of secure rights to property in various countries. So, taking the institutionalist view of economic development, in the monograph what we're doing is looking at one of the particular institutions that's been especially important for economic development purposes in the developed world, and that is having secure rights to property. And we identify the fact that this right is oftentimes lacking in the developing world. In the monograph, we make the case that secure rights to property can be created through different means. It's not necessarily the case that secure rights to property are created only by statutory means. This is one path to creating, or one potential path to creating secure rights to property. On the other hand, however, in Africa and many other parts of the world, secure rights to property are oftentimes created through an evolutionary process. Local people recognize their local needs, create, amend, modify property rights in order to meet the local situation, local circumstances. Oftentimes in Africa, these customarily evolved rights and norms receive strong protection from traditional authorities. However, when governments take over, when governments interfere with the actions of traditional authorities, the security of property rights can be lost, and people face insecurity in terms of holding, using, transferring property rights. And this is a real impediment to economic growth in many parts of the world. The monograph suggests that there is no one path to property, and that indeed thinking about property rights as having a one-size-fits-all solution is naive at best and harmful at worst. Rather, rights exist along a continuum. One could potentially create secure rights to property through a legislative path. On the other hand, one could wait and allow more secure rights to property to evolve over time. In the monograph, we look at different cases, drawing on fieldwork that we've done over the past several years, that highlight examples of positive paths to the legislative creation of property. We also look at some examples of the evolutionary path to the creation of property, talk about difficulties that are faced in both paths, and suggest a basic toolbox that policymakers should take into consideration as they're thinking through appropriate property reforms in their particular countries.
From your work in Africa, can you give us some examples of how countries have successfully created or expanded property rights?
Yes, I can. I think there's one really encouraging example that comes from Namibia. In Namibia in 1996, the government changed the legal environment, and it did so by devolving rights to manage wildlife to local people, local rural Namibians, who have lived typically subsistence livelihoods in the countryside, raising small stock, raising goats, raising cattle. In 1996, though, the government decided to adopt what's a very progressive policy, and the policy was give the local people rights to manage wildlife in their areas and allow them to benefit directly from tourism that would result from people going to visit the area to see the wildlife that exists there. This was a change to the legal environment, as I said. It was an amendment passed to the Nature Conservation Act in Namibia. The government, in essence, gave local Namibians a thicker bundle of property rights than they had previously held. Before 1996, local Namibians didn't have the legal right to manage wildlife. Not surprisingly, they had few incentives to protect wildlife. Once they received the legal right to manage the wildlife and, importantly, to benefit from tourism on their own lands, their incentive structure changed. And today what you'll see in northwest Namibia and northeast Namibia is local people taking the time, going to the effort to protect wildlife. And the benefits that have flowed from this change to the policy and legal environment have been at least twofold. On the one hand, numbers of wildlife in Namibia are rising dramatically on conservancy lands. Local people get the legal rights to manage wildlife when they voluntarily form into conservancies, create a conservancy constitution, create a wildlife management plan, create a distribution plan for any profits that the conservancy makes. As a result of this, there are increasing numbers of conservancies. Conservancies are protecting animals on their lands, and you're seeing this in terms of wildlife numbers on the ground. There are increasing numbers of animals such as kudu, giraffe, ostrich, the endangered desert elephant, the endangered desert rhino, and even the endangered desert lion is coming back in force in northern Namibia as a result of this change of incentives. But at the same time, what's also happening is that conservancies are gaining greater amounts of income because now they have a valuable resource on their land that simply wasn't there back in the 1980s. They have animals and a beautiful environment. And tourists increasingly are going to Namibia to see what exists on the ground in that country. Conservancies are able to take advantage of these tourists who come in and who bring their dollars or their pounds or their euro with them because they enter into contracts with local development companies who build hotels. Conservancies enter into a contractual arrangement. The contract includes terms that say local people are required to be trained by these organizations, these companies, these hotel management companies. But at the end of the contract's term, 15, 20 years down the road, the conservancy itself will actually get full ownership rights over the hotels. So local people are being trained, they're developing human capital, they're being given a skill set that they need so that at some point in the future they'll take control of a valuable resource. Not only do they have control over the wildlife, at some point in the not-too-distant future, they'll also have control over the hotel and other amenities that are on their conservancy lands. So this has been a very positive development, and I think is an excellent example in Africa of expanding a set of property rights in a way that's broadly benefiting people, marrying two important goals, I think, one of which is economic development, the other of which is conservation.